Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Greg Zaro, Associate Professor of Anthropology and Climate Change at the University of Maine. Greg and I met a few years ago when he started a Climate on Tap speaker series and teamed up with the Maine Discovery Museum. After many great conversations and one excellent talk by Greg about his research, I knew that I wanted to talk to him for the podcast. Our conversation was recorded in October 2025. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Greg, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast.
Thank you.
This is a great conversation for me because we actually have known each other for a while, so it's very casual and fun, I hope, is kind of the goal. I'm quite sure you're my first anthropologist on the podcast, which is a part of science I don't know nearly enough about, and also one I want to explore more. So one of the coolest things for me is that your background started with Spanish, if I have it right, as a degree, and then I would say continued on the path and went into really cool climate change and anthropology. And so mostly what I'm curious about is the pivot. Maybe it's not a pivot. This is the part I don't know. So I'm going to stop and you let me know like how you went from Spanish and then towards anthropology and what inspired that.
Okay. It's a fun story for me, hopefully for others. My parents and aunts and uncles were all in the travel business. So they traveled around the world a lot. And my dad, when I was in high school, just before graduation, took me to Peru. And I had not studied Spanish at that time. I studied French in high school for a couple of years, but it was really just an educational requirement for me. I didn't have any interest in pursuing a language at that point. And he took me to Peru for a 10-day trip. We went to Bolivia and Highland Peru, and I fell in love with Spanish language, with archaeology, anthropology, and I came back thinking, this is what I'm doing when I go to college. And started at Western Washington University to study Spanish and anthropology, and kind of felt like I had wanderlust. I really wanted to explore new places. I grew up in Washington State, and I started questioning whether I could make a career in anthropology or not. So I decided I was going to focus just on Spanish. And I ended up transferring to the University of Texas that had a really highly rated Spanish program. But when I got there, I also found out they had these amazing Latin American focused programs in geography and anthropology, archaeology. So I started taking those courses too as just out of interest and decided I wasn't ready to part ways with that path and continued on. So the Spanish was more supporting cast, even though that was my major. It was really just the means to be able to work in Latin America, which is where the first half of my career was mostly spent in Peru and Belize in archaeology. So in Peru, it was the mode of communication. So I was really excited to use it professionally. And the work I was doing in Peru was always just this engagement between people and their environment. So that's where the Climate Change Institute appointment came into play when I was hired at University of Maine. I was really looking at long-term human-environment interactions on the south coast of Peru, which is a hyper-arid desert. But people have been there for thousands of years, and I was interested to see how they managed their lives in a desert environment like that. So my appointment in archaeology here came after that long process of exploring Latin American peoples and societies.
How do you study the interaction of humans with their environment in the current day and then going back? Like, what does that look like? This is going to horrify you, but my entire experience with archaeology stems from watching Indiana Jones. So I know that's not what it is. So if you could kind of talk us through that, that would be really great.
So my focus, everyone has sort of a specialty, a specialization. My interest, particularly in Peru, was really focused on agrarian landscapes. So I envisioned agriculture as being kind of a link between people and their environment because it's an active manipulation of people, of soils, of water, of plants, of microorganisms. And so I felt like that was an interesting measure of how the environment changes, is how is agriculture changing. But knowing that it's not simply a response to climate, it's a response to a lot of different social and environmental factors. But I felt that was a strong point of contact between people and their wider surroundings. So I studied the environment from an agricultural perspective, looking at the ways that people managed agriculture in a desert environment, of constructing canals, of constructing terraces, of resource switching from a focus on predominantly marine resources to a mixed economy of agriculture and fishing and even raising camelids, to one that transitioned into the Spanish colonial era, which had another transformation that saw a lot of abandonment of some of these landscapes, but a reinstitution of farming through olive cultivation. So you have this transition from a Mediterranean economy into South Coast Peru, and you start seeing the emergence of grapes and olives as being commercial crops. So I looked at that transition over the long term and looking at the extent to which land use expanded or contracted over time and comparing against broader climate and environmental records to understand those connections.
Is it surprising to you that the transfer to kind of the Mediterranean crop part took or not?
Not in that environment. So, the Americas experienced a massive population decline in advance even of Europeans arriving because of disease. So there was a big population crash in southern Peru. But also even prior to that, there was sort of an abandoned period along this coast, even prior to European arrival. So there was not much of an Inca component. So if we think of the chronology, we know Spanish arrival in the 1500s. Prior to that, Inca dominated the Andean landscape with a lot of independent ethnic populations around the Andes. One of these populations prior to even the Inca expansion was called Chiribaya in South Coast Peru. Chiribaya kind of came to a close, at least in this part of southern Peru, and there's a period of abandonment along this coast. When we did an archaeological survey, we found lots of Chiribaya up to about 1400 Common Era. And then there's this period of almost nothing. We found a single artifact that related to the Inca period. And then you have Spanish colonial materials of glazed pottery and olives, which are an introduction from Europe. So it didn't surprise me in the sense that you don't have much in the way of living populations. Olives are much easier to manage with smaller populations. It's a tree crop. You don't need the same kind of labor structure. And this entire coastline was kind of depopulated, right up into the modern era, really. Even though there's agriculture persisting, it's doing it in a different way than it was in the past prior to even the Inca period, where there was a big resident population there. So you have people living there, lots of foot traffic up and down this coast, people fishing and shellfishing, raising crops, building terraces, raising camelids. You go from that scenario to one where there's just a few isolated farmsteads, where there's a focus on olive culture. What I've become more interested in these days is connecting the past with the present. So not staying in the past as an archaeologist, but trying to attach it to the historic records and even to looking at the modern era to understand the context of what we see today in terms of urbanization and land use changes. So even today, the coastline remains kind of barren with some few isolated farmsteads as the port city of Ilo starts expanding in population. So those things are all kind of interesting to me, of using that land use and land cover change as an indicator into the present era of what we experience today.
Is connecting it to present day where part of the anthropology comes in or not? Do I have that correct?
Yeah, so archaeology is part of anthropology in that we're studying people in the past. My focus on landscapes now, as you know, I work in the Mediterranean, but it's the same kinds of variables in understanding land use, land cover change, and urbanization into the modern era. And I found that to be a better talking point when I talk to students, when I talk to my colleagues, when I talk to the public, when I talk to my family about what it is I do and why I feel it's important, is that we have tended in archaeology to study the past, and the public views it as an interesting subject matter, but it's something of the past, and how relevant is it today? And I feel like if you can show these tangible connections between past and present, then it becomes more identifiable and relevant to living people today, because they recognize their parents' generation, their grandparents, and with some, they recognize their great-grandparents' generation, and then it gets a little fuzzy. But if I can connect records back to those times and even further, and then try to get people to really think about, our scale of time is really warped as a living human being, because we're kind of stuck with about 100-year cycles. But if you can get people to think generation after generation after generation, then it becomes to make sense that what we're in today is inheriting these, millennial scale decisions that people have made about land cover and land use. It's not that, okay, it's our turn to interact with the natural environment. We are inheriting a completely anthropogenic landscape that is contingent upon what people before us did. So my hope is that they understand what we're doing now, we're somebody else's past. So whoever that is in the future is going to inherit what we're doing today. And that's an important thing to think about.
I think that's a great tagline to think about it, that we're somebody else's past. This is a great segue into the part of your work that I actually do know a smidge about, thanks to the talk you gave as part of Climate on Tap in Croatia, right? You said you're working in the Mediterranean. I don't remember how many times you've gone back to this site, but the parts that I loved most about your talk was how you did make it super relevant to what that area looks like now, and then showed all this amazing work of that was how it was, I want to say 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Is that too long?
No, 2 to 3 is about what we're dealing with.
It was amazing. It really did to me as this novice pedestrian off the street. You could see the topography. You could see kind of what I would call satellite imaging. They just perfectly aligned and overlapped and was fascinating. So I have two questions. One, why did you pivot to Croatia and Mediterranean? And I guess 2 and 3, it seems to me you could spend the next 40 years of your life going back to those sites and learning little bit. So how do you manage that? And how do you figure out what parts of it you want to study?
The easier question is the why Croatia. It started with the Fulbright Scholar Award in 2013. I applied for it thinking I wanted to explore these interests in a new part of the world. So I applied for this Fulbright to Croatia in 2013 and was awarded a semester long. We ended up being there about 8 months, a teaching and research award to the University of Zadar, which is right on the coast in Croatia, to teach a course on humans and environment and to basically spend my time researching and looking for potentials to develop a longer term project, gauge the interest of Croatian colleagues if they might be interested in collaborating on something. And I found a lot of really warm responses from geographers, from anthropologists, and from archaeologists. So we ended up, going back and getting money from National Geographic Society to support the first part of the work, Rust Family Foundation, and then my colleague got a grant from the Croatian Science Foundation. So we co-directed this project with Croatian Science Foundation funding for a number of years. Bringing students from the University of Maine was a big joy for me, and having students from the University of Zadar. So we decided at the site we were excavating, which extends back to the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, so about 3,000 years ago, continuous occupation up to about 1,500 years ago. There's a bit of a gap, and then reoccupation in the later Middle Ages and early modern era before it is fully archaeological now. We took pride in pairing up groups of Maine students with groups of Croatian students, sit them in units and, making this part of their experience, this kind of cultural exchange program, which one of the taglines from Fulbright that I really appreciated was mutual understanding between nations and how we build that. So my colleague in Croatia and I decided to build that by making sure that these were mixed groups of students that working together, and they forged great relationships over that time. COVID kind of quickly shut this down. And while that site was fully archaeological, I spent my next 2 years dreaming about being back on the Adriatic and staring at a lot of satellite images. And a lot of what I learned in that first year was understanding Zadar's history as a 3,000-year-old city, but also one that's a living city today. And recognizing the distinctive neighborhoods and the pattern of spatial organization within the city, I started recognizing elements of the old landscape that was prior to this 20th century expansion. And I started gaining more interest in doing work focused not exclusively on Zadar as a living city, but thinking about it more holistically as looking at urbanization and land cover change over the last 3,000 years. So my focus became Zadar, and recognizing that like many old historic Mediterranean cities, they experienced a rapid period of land cover expansion, urban expansion, in the last century and a half. And what that land cover expanded onto was an old agrarian landscape that had supported this city and other cities in the Mediterranean for the greater parts of 1, 2, 3,000 years. And there are little elements of that old landscape that pop up here and there in these cityscapes, sometimes as abandoned field plots with old dry stone walls and terraces that are still there but overgrown, and other times living fields and olive groves that are still organized in the same spatial way that they were centuries ago. In other cases that we're finding in Zadar, the organization of streets and alleys actually map on to the old agrarian landscape in ways that most people don't recognize. And some of that is even Roman land survey lines from 2,000 years ago. You have major avenues running along those in a very regular grid, and then a very organic pattern of streets and alleys where you can get lost even on foot trying to get your way around. But now I recognize there's a pattern to that madness, that it's mapping on in great part to the old agrarian landscape. And so we're trying to promote those aspects of the city outside what is traditionally the focus of history as the old historic town core. So we're interested in a lot of that these days. But what really inspired me about it was reading United Nations reports on world urbanization that come out regular increments. And what they've identified is that globally, the world had a tipping point or reached a milestone, I should say, in 2007 of more than 50% of the global human population now is urbanized or lives in cities. And that number is growing, and it's expected to be 2/3 by, I think, 2050. And so I felt, as an archaeologist, we can actually look at what does this process look like of change from a material science perspective. By looking at it at Zadar, we see this rapid change in urban land cover that the pace of it can only really be comprehended by looking at 3,000 years of its history. So you have this real kind of steady state environment for the greater part of multi-millennia, and then suddenly this rapid expansion of urban land cover. And it is really just unprecedented. But it's not a unique case. This is the world over in the 20th century. Characterizing that from a material science perspective, I think, can really snap us all into recognizing just how rapidly the planet is changing right now.
I don't think anybody would be surprised to hear me say that part of the rapid changing that's going on in the world is climate change and the human impact of that. But it also sounds like societally, what you're saying, there's a huge rapid change going on in the world as well. Are there theories as to why? Like, why is it such a drastic increase in urban living?
Well, that's a good question too, but it's maybe why is there decay in rural living, rural life, and access to resources and social opportunities. But you think about industrialization post-World War II and some of these landscapes that drew a lot of people from rural countrysides for more opportunities within a city. So you have at the same time an abandoning of the rural countryside, you have a growth in these urban centers. So those two processes are linked. And to think about how these agrarian landscapes become devalued in that sense, and then urban growth expands on top of it, you're at once replacing what has been a fairly resilient landscape, and resilient meaning it can really respond to a lot of changes and wiggles in not just the environment, but human society. You can shift it to agriculture or to grazing or recreational space or just forestry. Those shifts can happen much more easily than, once you convert something to urban land cover, the options become much more limited or much more expensive to institute if you want to make changes in a resilient kind of a way. So I think it's part of a really complicated entanglement, but this rural to urban migration, post-industrialization is probably part of it, of looking for different kinds of opportunities.
So you had said this area of Croatia had for centuries really sustained its own city and regions, I assume with agriculture and other things. What is sustaining the urban life now? Is this a function of, kind of what I would call modern society and efficiencies and the ability to have global shipping and things like that? Like you don't need to rely on it quite so locally. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's pretty fair. Yeah. I think in this part of the world too, a big driver of change, not the only driver, but a big one is tourism. That it's really exploded in the last half century. And even more so now, I think once Croatia joined the European Union and then adopted the euro, it's made it even more open for people to come and visit. And it's an amazing place. It's beautiful. It's warm. It's got a lot of recreational opportunities. It has one of the most amazing coastlines in the world and dotted with many islands. It's a yachter's paradise. But it comes with challenges, and a lot of that challenge is rapid development. So there's a lot of construction projects now that we've been recognizing that what's chewing up the green space that we see as being left over from the old agrarian landscape, it's development of these new apartment complexes, many of which are going to become rentals for tourism. And this kind of driver is also happening broadly across the Mediterranean, but it also elevates prices within these town centers. It makes it unaffordable for local populations to be there, but they have a really strong seasonal round of this. So a lot of people invest their livelihood in tourism for, 4 or 5 intense months, and then these become sleepy little coastal towns through the winter months. It's not a whole lot different than Maine, from my understanding.
Yeah, I was thinking of Bar Harbor and a trip we took probably 20 years ago now. in the winter when we had the whole place to ourselves, but it was very sleepy.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, looking back 3,000 years up to the present day, how much are you able to help inform policymakers who are trying to figure out how to manage what you've said is truly unprecedented? And is that something that you're trying to do?
That's the current state of what we're trying to do. So we don't have any results of that yet, but there's a new project. One of my colleagues in Zadar who shares, I think, equal passion about recognizing the unrecognized in terms of the old agrarian history of Zadar, even some of the industrial history of looking at it through time. Her interest is Roman centuriation, which is the form of Roman land survey that dissected the landscape into a grid. It's generally commonly around 700 meters or so, 710 meters on a side. But that grid is maintained oftentimes through old rural roads or field walls. And in the case of Zadar, we see it in historic aerial photographs before the city expanded. So we have these beautiful Royal Air Force images from 1944 that was prior to this massive urban expansion. And Zadar is still a moderately sized city. So I don't want to, it's not a metropolis by any sense. But its land cover has gone over the top of this. It was where we see the Roman roads now within urban land cover. We can look at recognizing that and recognizing Roman survey beyond the urban land cover, recognizing the industrial scape that occurred post-World War II. And what she wants to do is kind of investigate how does Roman land survey, centuriation, shape settlements and land use across centuries. So instituted 2,000 years ago, but how did it shape settlement in the Middle Ages? How did it shape settlement in the modern era? How does it continue to shape Zadar as a contemporary city? And this allows us to bring in the local community to understand their perceptions of this change, particularly the folks that have been, longtime residents of Zadar, maybe 60, 70 years and plus, to understand their perceptions of change and ask them what they value about Zadar's landscape. We would love to promote and work with city planners to say, hey, there's a part of the uniqueness or the identity of Zadar that's getting lost. So everyone wants to focus their effort on the Old Town Peninsula, which has Iron Age, Roman, Middle Ages, early modern era architecture, beautiful stuff. Conservation efforts are all there. That's where all the tourists go. What it looks like outside of that is this homogeneous expansion of residential commercial districts, right? Neighborhoods. And what we're saying is it's not as homogeneous as it might look. And there's areas that if we act now, we can actually protect them to feed into this local and historical identity of Zadar. If people want to maintain that, it can help make the city more livable by recognizing this kind of historical diverse landscape. But if there's still living green spaces, whether they're abandoned plots or forests or even cultivated, they can help mitigate some of the effects of a warming world as well. So there's a lot of benefits to recognizing and promoting them. The next step is to engage municipal leaders about how they may be able to draft policy that might reward protections of those. The problem is competing with the economy of land use and development and tourism. And, these are fetching high prices. I can't describe enough the setting of this city right on the Adriatic Sea. It draws a lot of attention. It draws a lot of people. So the price of land cover, the price of plots, the price of building is going to far exceed in an economic sense when you're thinking about just the return on dollars or euros. You're going to get much more for developing it into apartment blocks. But the long term, you can maintain a more sustainable and livable city by recognizing the contributions these either abandoned green spaces or even the structure of streets and neighborhoods, how they can contribute to the identity of the city over the long term.
Do you find that you have to take a step back as the outside American researcher and have your Croatian colleagues be the ones leading the charge on this?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would not do it on my own. I couldn't do it on my own. I'm not from there. I've spent a lot of time there. I feel like I'm somewhere in between a local and a tourist. Those that know me, they view us as one of them, but those that don't kind of view us as a tourist until they know why we're there. But I can't engage. I don't have the language skills either, even though English is pretty widely spoken in the city. But as an outsider, I think these kinds of policy shifts need to be done localized. They need to be ground up. They can't be an external person or model kind of being imposed. I want to be part of it because we bring different kinds of ideas about what can be shared and how we share it, and thinking about how we draft papers or ideas for different audiences, whether it be for academic or for the community or for municipal leaders. We sort of brainstorm ideas on what that looks like. So that part is necessary. I just couldn't do it on my own. I need people that live there and know people and already have their trust. Trust is a hard thing to build up. It's taken me more than a decade to build it up with my own colleagues, even. So that's something that they already have through their university leaders who also have connections with municipal leaders and can develop, hopefully, ideas that way.
I want to go back to what you said about the pandemic kind of put a pause on things, but it caused you to start looking at satellite images. And it sounds like almost a new approach in figuring out your research. Do you think you would have gone to that without it?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time on satellite. Honestly, I do really have wanderlust. I love being in Maine, but I love going other places. And if I feel stuck here too long and in the deep, dark winters of Maine sometimes, I find myself looking at other places in the world. And, you gain new perspectives on the world by looking at it from above. So I've long done that. But I think it was just, the right time to start doing something about it in an academic way. Because before then, it was sort of ideas that were developing while I was in Zadar that first stint for 8 months. And I started recognizing the interplay of tourism and land cover change. But I hadn't really done anything because we were knee deep in this archaeological project, which takes a tremendous amount of mental capacity and time and money. So that was really the focus. What the pandemic did was give me the opportunity to pause on that and rethink some other things, revisit some interests that had matured a bit more after spending more and more time there. They had this phrase that always struck me, the Croatian Tourist Board, I believe it was. But somewhere there was this phrase that said, Croatia, the Mediterranean as it once was. And what they were trying to pitch was this old, nucleated, medieval kind of a village surrounded by dry stone walls and terraces and olive groves and vineyards. And, it was a really romantic kind of picture of the Mediterranean. And that's what they were trying to draw upon because Croatia wasn't as developed as a lot of other Western European nations in this sense, in terms of land use and land cover, They still had a lot of these old stone villages, and they still do. But I started recognizing that what's getting lost in all of this development to accommodate the tourists is the very thing that's getting promoted to draw people in. And so that really stuck with me, from 2013 up until the pandemic. It was just brewing on me, watching construction cranes as part of the landscape of Zadar and thinking about this. It just gave me time to mature those ideas a little bit. And COVID gave me the time to start actually working on them actively.
I would imagine that growing up in Washington played no small part in wanderlust, given how far north that is and how long the winters are there too, at least darkness-wise.
Yeah, colder winters there. But, I like going back to Washington now. Growing up, I had wanderlust to leave, but now as an adult, you see things differently. And I enjoy being back to see my family. But yeah, just anywhere. I bounced around for school a lot as well, in Texas, New Mexico, Chicago, and then moved up here from New Mexico. So moving around is a big part of my life. It's hard for me to imagine that Maine now is my longest place of residence since coming here in 2006. So it exceeds my growing up through the age of 18 in Spokane, Washington, and just beyond that now. So that's interesting for me to think about, we'll say.
I'm going to say it's good for Maine and good for us. Going forward, are you still able to bring undergrads with you and do these projects? Or has that just gotten harder and harder, money-wise, otherwise?
It's gotten harder money-wise. It's getting more expensive to do those kinds of things. I looked into doing one a couple years ago, but I was restructuring it because we weren't doing excavation. It would have been more of a sort of a travel study course, but we would have set up in Zadar. It was a shorter period, and I don't know if that was less of a draw for people. When we had an archaeological field school, it was about a month. And it was mostly a month in Zadar with about 3 or 4 days of travel at the end to a couple of other places. But they had a sense of local living and archaeological field training, and we had lectures, and some weekend outings to different sites. And so it was really kind of a blend between archaeological field school and international study abroad kind of experience. Since we're not doing excavation right now, I was thinking about how I could create something that drew students in a different way. We didn't have enough interest, so we continued to rethink how we want to do it. I've taught a class through one of the international program partners that UMaine works with. I taught a class in Alicante a few years back that is another possibility, I think, to draw UMaine students into international context for study. So we continue to look at areas of interest for that and what students are looking to gain as experiences. My heart is with international education and archaeology, but I think I use archaeology and these kinds of landscape studies as a vehicle to get students to engage with other parts of the world, whether I'm trying to do it creatively within my own class when we're stuck here, but also create opportunities for students to experience this firsthand, maybe in a summer session or so.
Okay, one last question. That's totally ridiculous, but I want to ask it anyway. Do you miss not using Spanish all the time?
I do. I feel kind of embarrassed to rely on English in Croatia, whereas Spanish, I became fairly fluent when I worked there, and I still get by. We spent a couple months in Spain on sabbatical this past year doing kind of a parallel project to what we're doing in Zadar. And so I'm able to use my Spanish then. We try to go back to Mexico when we can. We enjoy spending time in Mexico and working there when we can. So I've had opportunities to continue using it. I go through bouts of being really committed to go into the Spanish conversation group here on campus. It's a weekly 1-hour group. And I've gone a few times this semester, but I need to get back into it. So I miss being able to use it. And I recognize that it's not something that's going to stick with me forever unless I continue to cultivate it. There was a point in my life where I could speak very fluently without thinking much about it. And I missed that time. But I don't know if I'll get back to that kind of proficiency unless I start living and working there regularly again.
How hard would it be to learn Croatian well enough to manage a conversation throughout a whole day?
It's a challenging language. They have like 7 different cases about the structure of words. And my approach is I would ignore all of those and focus on, am I communicating? That's my whole point. And I try to tell my own students, my own kids, when they learn another language, grammar and structure is great, but focus on communication is how you get better because the other stuff will come along. But not being shy and being able to make mistakes is the most important part initially. I get proficient at understanding a lot more by the end of a field season, but speaking is still very challenging for me. And I have access now, finally, to like a video course that I'm going to take on my own to start building my capacity a little bit. But it's just finding the time. And there's not a big group of Croatian language speakers here around me, so I can't engage in it regularly in a dialogue kind of a way. My wife does better because she was often the one to go into the marketplaces and negotiate with people about purchasing things. Not negotiate, but converse with them. And she was more open about making mistakes as well and had some comical errors, but she got better because she would interact more. My interaction is often in English, but when we're out on site, I'm around all the Croatian students who are speaking Croatian. So I end up picking up a lot, but I don't speak much.
Yeah. I sometimes feel like I have a hard time with English in general. But I think that we spent a year in Ireland, and even though we both spoke English, there were so many different ways and phrases and things. Like you just get stuck until you learn that culture. So I asked because I figured you feel like you're missing a little bit of the culture and you'd like to grab a little bit more of it.
Absolutely. That's a great way to phrase it. There's things that people express in their native language that they can't in a second or third language. It's just there's a deep-seated meaning in language that sometimes you can't get around no matter how proficient you get in another language. I wish I had more skill sets, though, to express myself in Croatian and to show that I value their language and culture, which I do tremendously. But having the time set aside to dedicate, part of it is I knew what it took with Spanish. I had a 4-year degree. I spent 6 months in Peru for my dissertation and a lot of other smaller chunks of time, 1 to 2 months field seasons there. Outside of that, and I feel like it's just been, I'm not sure where I would carve out that kind of focused attention when I have so many other responsibilities at this level of my life than I did back then.
Well, Greg, this has been a delight to talk to you. I feel like we literally did just scratch the surface of your work. No pun intended on that one. I remain fascinated at the idea of not just learning from the past, I think that's obvious, but also bringing it into the present. What you're trying to do, I think, with your work is really fascinating because you're asking us to look beyond our own immediate, not just lifetime, but like the next 10 years, to look out. And that's a hard thing to do. But showing that there's been this consistent approach over thousands and thousands of years from other humans, I think it's just fascinating. It's nice to know that many people have had these thoughts, whether consciously or not, and humans have built on each other.
Pretty accurate. This is a good wrap up.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by following us on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is executive produced and hosted by me, Kate Dickerson, and edited and produced by Scott Loiselle. And the Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.